take me back, they are very rich indeed. They take me back years ago. Come with me to Central Florida, to Orlando. I was a youth pastor for several years after college in just north of Orlando, Florida. And when I was about 23, I heard the call from God to explore whether I should be a priest, an ordained priest. And so I started a process that you may not know, that in the Episcopal Church and many of our mainline churches, it's quite a process towards ordination. There's a battery of tests. It takes about 1.5 years to almost 2 years before you get to your final interview. There were physicals, there were psychological tests, there's a psychiatric test. You can imagine how that went with me. The psychiatrist gave me the Rorschach ink blot test. Does anybody remember that you're supposed to tell them what you see with a big splotchy black ink? I told him that every picture looked like my mother. That sped it along. The intelligence test, that did not go well at all. And so at the end of all this, I was convinced that in no way did God want me to be a priest at all. I was going to go back to Winn-Dixie grocery store, maybe construction or something. And so I went to the final interview, and here are about 12 people around this table. And the head of the committee was the most respected priest in Central Florida. His name was Father Dick Bowman. And he was balding in his older age, and he had kind of an Irish beard. And he would stroke his beard as he considered godly things. And he'd say something incredibly wise, you know. And he was very intimidating. And I knew that to use secular language, I was hosed. Because my first church as a youth pastor, I had just been hired about 6 months on. Father Bowman had come to be the interim rector, the interim priest of this church. And his first act was to fire me. And he was the head of the committee to which I went when I was being considered for ordination. The whole interview, I just knew that I was done. And I didn't interview very well at all, actually. I was getting ready for the inevitable answer. So another 11 members of the committee at the end of the interview all looked to Father Bowman. He sat back in his chair and he stroked his Irish beard. And I thought, oh boy, here it comes. And he said, Mr. Keith, you will go to seminary. You know, like several of the members stared at him in utter amazement. I was dumbfounded. And he said, because God must have a plan for someone like you. This was my entrance into the process to go to seminary. And I walked out, and I learned years later that Father Bowman was interior to the conversation, was one of my most ardent defenders. But I didn't know that at the time. Have you ever received an answer that you weren't expecting? More to the point, have you ever received an answer from God that you were not expecting? Some people say that God doesn't speak. I don't think that's true. In fact, I know it's not true. God speaks all the time. The question is, A, can we slow down enough? Can we turn everything else off to actually hear God's voice? And the second thing is, are we prepared for the answer? You know what they say, don't ask the question unless you're ready for the answer. But the readings today tell us what my experience was years ago. We are never ready for the answer that God gives. God never gives us the answer that we think. I appreciate Jim trying to explain Job to you. I want to tell you that we have very polite readers in our church. They work hard to prepare the readings. They're so polite that you may miss the force of this. I can't believe you just said, you just said like 4 minutes ago, the word of the Lord. Jim says the word of the Lord, and what do you say? Really? Why didn't you stand? This is the sleep-deprived part of the sermon. Why didn't you stand up and go, what the heck? You've got to be kidding me. That's God? So here's Job. The story, by the way, predates Abraham. It's older than 2000 BC. It's a very ancient story. And here's why. Job is a wonderful man who's living a perfectly great life. Everything is taken away from him. He suffers unbelievable tragedy. And he says to God, I'm translating from the Hebrew for young ears, what the heck? Why? Why does this happen to me? I didn't plan for any of this. And he says in last week's reading, this was just 7 days ago, if I could only go before the Lord. I mean, if I could explain myself to God, He would make everything right. You ever have a Job day like that? If I could only explain to God, He would understand. And Job says that right before this reading. And God shows up. And Job's ready. And God speaks out of the whirlwind. The beautiful picture that I chose from William Blake on the cover tries to capture this moment of God speaking out of the tempest to Job. So God's shown up. Job knows exactly what's about to happen. And God says something that every husband here has heard. Who is speaking so stupidly that your counsel is without wisdom? Any married man ever hear this? You're talking, dear. I'm just not hearing you because you're not saying anything really important. God says, why don't you put your big boy pants on, Job, and let me ask you, that's exactly what he says in Hebrew, let me ask you a few questions. Where the hell were you when I set the foundations of the world? Well, feel free to tell me. Where were you when I set the stars in the heavens and I ignited the sun to burn with a radiance that would last for eons? Job, where were you there? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? And I made the sun and the moon to rise and set. I made the rain to fall and the snow to fall and the leaves to turn. Job, now where were you again? This is God's way of saying to me, you know, I might have gotten along without you before 1964. I don't know what God did before 1964. I wasn't around to help him. How did he get by? Friends, as the Episcopal Church, we're only going to give you just a few short verses of the ultimate come to Yahweh moment. There is a yard sale because God chews Job out for chapters after this. Feel free to read the whole thing. It is exquisitely poignant. And the entire point is, God says to Job, I am not the person that you think. You cannot put me in a box. You cannot explain me. You cannot predict me. I am never going to be exactly what you think. C.S. Lewis wrote in Narnia, Aslan is not a tame lion. You see, God is higher and different. And sometimes God does things that we do not expect. And God says to Job, I have every right to be inscrutable and mysterious, and you're not going to get it. Can you imagine Job in that moment? Haven't you been Job? I've been there so many times. Why, Lord, is this happening to me? Why, this isn't fair. It isn't right. It's not what I expected. This should be different or better. And we never get the answer we think. What happens after this chapter's long chew out? Does anybody know, for extra Bible points, the end of the book of Job? He's restored 7 or 10-fold. You see, because the one thing that Job does is stay in the conversation with God. He doesn't curse God like his wife told him to do. He doesn't explain away God like his pathetic friends try to do. He stays with God, and God stays with him. It's so important, I'm learning, to stay with the Lord, because the Lord stays with us in those moments every time. Let's go to the Hebrews reading. And might be inscrutable. If you're not read up on Melchizedek, you're just missing out on the joy of New Testament study. One of my favorite superheroes of the Bible, Melchizedek, big cape and, M on his chest. You might have missed the subtlety of the reading, but may I tell you that there were Jewish believers in Jesus that were starting to be persecuted. They were starting to be executed. They were starting to question their faith. They had been taught from the time they were young that the Messiah was going to come. The Messiah was going to put things right. The way our country used to be, and now it's not. I know this is so hypothetical. God would put everything right through the Messiah. And Jesus comes, and what happens? He's executed on the cross. He suffers horribly. And then he dies. And they say, well, we weren't expecting God like this. This is not, what is this? This isn't any God that we know. And the writer of Hebrews anonymously said, actually, this is exactly how God is. God shows up in the suffering, in the weakness. God shows up, did you hear our church described in Hebrews? In the ignorant and wayward. That's us. And Hebrews says this is God's plan. This is how God chose to save the world. Eternal salvation. This is the plan. It's not what you thought. And all those Jewish believers need to reconsider everything they thought was true. Does that at all sound familiar right now? Let's go to the final passage. Did you hear James and John? Let's recast it in a way that you can understand pretty easily. James and John and the disciples have just gone to Bravo. They've heard the best music in the entire world. They walk out in a beautiful summer night. They go into one of the best restaurants of the Rocky Mountain West. They go up to the maitre d' and they ask for their table by the window. And guess what? It's not available. And they're seated somewhere else. Have you ever seen James and John in a restaurant after Bravo? It's one of the most beautiful evenings in the world, and they melt down in a way that is hard to describe on YouTube. They're willing to have an entire evening because they can't sit right there. And by the way, if anybody's been in this situation, can I assure you, yes, the kitchen staff knows who you are, and they know where you're from. They really don't care. They really don't. James and John said, we're going to sit next to Jesus. We're going to be the greatest. This is the way he's going to be. And Jesus, can you hear him? And oy vey. They still don't get it. Jesus says there's two kinds of people. The people that expect service and the people who ask, how can we serve? Jesus said, let me tell you about God. God is the latter kind. When I interviewed with your vestry 20 years ago last week, I asked a question. I said, how many people after a potluck stay to clean up? And you know what the answer was? I interviewed at 5 Episcopal churches, and your church was the one church that gave this answer. One church back east said, we pay people to do that. And I said, thank you very much. Your church leaders said, Jimmy Vail was in the room. So was Ernie and Joe Brown. Your church leaders said, we all do that. What else would we do? I walked out of that meeting and I called my wife and I said, it's crazy, but I think it's this church. Because you're a church that knows what it means to serve. And not to be served. When you show up, the question that you ask more than any other question, and it's so beautiful, is how can we help? Two kinds of kids last night at the dance, right? The ones that leave and the ones that stay. You guys are the ones that stay. That's what Jesus was talking about. How can we serve? How can we help? Have you ever asked a question that you're not prepared for the answer? What's our question today? Anybody want to be Job? Anybody got it for the Lord? And he's just going to understand? Feel free to raise your hands. How about Hebrews? Anybody in Hebrews? Anybody think the country's going to hell and God's going to set it all right and that's really the plan? Feel free to raise your hand. You'll be on YouTube also. How about James and John? Anybody just know that you're going to be right next to Jesus and this is the most important thing and where's my first course? Feel free to raise your hand. Does anybody else have a question for the Lord today? A real question. A life-changing question. What might he say? It will not be what we expect. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy